All right, today we're going to talk about Napoleon. Napoleon Bonaparte. We talked about the French Revolution previously, and we mentioned right at the end of that there was a commander, a military leader named Napoleon, who was brought in. So today I want to give you a little introduction to Napoleon and the Napoleonic period of history. Napoleon was, in many ways, the French didn't really think he was French. Why? Because he wasn't born in France. He was born in Corsica. Corsica was an island. The island was taken over by the French. So the people of Corsica prior to that were really more closely affiliated with Italy than they were France. And he's sent off to military school in France, and when he arrives, he doesn't really look like the other students. His skin is a little darker. His voice has, his French has an accent. By the way, I guess we're not supposed to say, I can't say the word he was short, right? He was vertically challenged. I don't know how I'm supposed to say that. He was like 5'4", 5'5", something like that. So, he was, can I say short? He was short. Okay. He was short. I don't know what I can say, I can't say anymore. He was short. Now, that meant that he sort of had, at least three things when he showed up that made him feel like he didn't really fit in, right? He was shorter than everybody else. He was looked a little more Italian, however you want to call it. He didn't really look like the French students, and his French had a little bit of an accent to it, right? And so a lot of students didn't really see him as being French, because you have to remember that if you're going to military school to become an officer, typically the only people who became officers were people from the nobility, people from the upper part of society. And he was sent there because his father had enough money to send him, but he was kind of seen as an outsider. All right. He did not have a noble birth. But the thing that's going to allow Napoleon to move up so quickly is the French Revolution. Without the French Revolution, he would have never have made it to the status that he made it. I mean, there's no doubt about it. He was a product, in many ways, of the French Revolution. And at a very young age, 24 years old, he was a brigadier general. That's pretty high up, by the way, especially for somebody 24. And why did that happen? Because you remember, France had the revolution, and then the French government decided to send everybody into war, right? That they were going to export the revolution. Remember, we talked about that before. And when they did that, it wasn't going well. A lot of people died. People weren't doing well. Napoleon was sort of one of the only guys who was having any success. And because of that, he was promoted. It's called a battlefield promotion. You may have never heard that kind of terminology. But, it's still around. A battlefield promotion doesn't necessarily mean you have to be in the military to get that. That just means everybody else has died or has quit, or, the situation is bad, and so we just take whoever's there and say, okay, you know what? You're in charge now. This guy died, this guy ran off, whatever. This guy's losing, so we go, who else we got? Well, this guy's doing well. All right, guess what? You're in charge now. So we call that a battlefield promotion. That means you're not going through sort of the normal channels of being promoted. You're being promoted more quickly because of the crisis situation that you're in. Well, it may have never happened to you yet, but it may well happen to you. Right? It's happened to me a few times. Well, the other thing is he ends up marrying a woman by the name of Josephine. There's a good name for you, looking for names. Josephine. Napoleon and Josephine. Why, there you go. There's your kid names right there. Well, Josephine was older than Napoleon. Napoleon was, we don't have much time to talk about all the details. I teach a whole class on the French Revolution and Napoleon, so, I got to watch that I don't go down too many rabbit trails. But he was really in love with her. She was not really in love with him. Okay? He was off at battle a lot, and that was okay with her. She was back in Paris, and, she was going to parties and having fun, and he was off at battle. And he would write her these letters like, oh, I miss you, da-da-da-da-da-da. And then she would get those letters, and sometimes she would read them to her friends and kind of laugh about it, if the sources we have are correct. So you're starting to get the idea. Now, eventually the tables kind of turn because Napoleon really becomes very powerful, and Josephine takes that ride with him. She becomes powerful. I guess I'm getting ahead of my story. So, and then he eventually, he kind of finds out about it. Well, that's a soap opera. We don't have time for soap opera stuff. But I'm just trying to tell you, these are real people, right? With real problems and concerns. But Josephine is a connection for him that actually helps him get advancement. Because she knows all the powerful men. I'm not going to say how she knows all the powerful men, but she knows a lot of powerful men, and that will end up helping Napoleon get the chance to come in for the directory and do some things that really gets him noticed. Okay. Now, Napoleon had some real victories against the Austrians in the northern part of Italy. Got him noticed. He was a good self-promoter. You've probably known some people like this, right? They're very good at promoting themselves and letting everybody know just how great they are. Napoleon was pretty good at that. One of the things Napoleon would do was to write stories about, write what he had done, and then send it back to Paris so it would be put like in the newspaper so everybody would read it. He also had a guy go out with him, on the battlefield and paint a picture of him. Sort of like an early selfie, except this was painted. On a horse. And the horse, the horse is like up on its hind legs, and he's sitting there, with his uniform on. And the guy paints the paint. Now, the horse can't stand up like that all the time, but that's the way the guy painted it. Like Napoleon goes into battle. Napoleon wins the victory. Here is a great painting, oil painting of Napoleon. This is the kind of stuff he did to promote himself. Now, to make sure he got more publicity, so he wins against the Austrians. He gets them to give up Belgium to France. He's one of the highlights of all these battles the French have. Remember, they're losing a lot of them. They've been losing a lot of battles. Napoleon is the guy who's winning. People tend to like somebody who wins. When I tell you maybe there was a team that has never won a game, and then you ask me, are they going to win someday? I say, no. Not this season. I don't see it happening. That's what I'm saying. Do I want them to win? Sure, I want them to win a game some point, but I don't think it's going to happen. I'm looking at the teams they're going to play, and it's just like, that's not going to happen. Anyway, people like people that win. They tend to like them more than they like people that lose. That's just human nature, I guess. And Napoleon was winning. Napoleon was making a name for himself, and Napoleon was very good at promoting himself and promoting this idea that he was a winner, that he was a leader. Well, we have that today. We call it social media, right? Occasionally somebody does, and I want to send them I get on Facebook sometimes, and I'll see, people just like, what do I call it? I call it, you know what I'm talking about, TMI. You know what that is? Too much information. It's just some stuff, really, I think, whoa, really? You're going to write all that? You're going to show a picture of that? Really? Like somebody might hire you someday is going to probably see all this, and other people are, in other words, I'm just saying, I'm not saying to lie, but I'm just saying, why? This is not your diary, is what I'm saying. And it used to be people had a diary, they would write in the diary and have a little lock on it, and they would hide it somewhere so their brother or somebody didn't find it. Now you just get on their Facebook or whatever, and everybody in the world potentially can see it, right? I don't know. Anyway, but also like many people on Facebook, most people tend to just show you the good stuff, right? I'm happy, I had a great meal, I'm on vacation, here's a nice picture of a mountain, a sunset, or whatever, and that's nice. But obviously, when I look at it, I think, probably your day is not always nice food, beautiful views, and smiling times. There might be some times it's not like that. I hope that's the way it is, but if realistically, I know it's not. Napoleon was very good at capturing those great moments and letting everybody know about the great. Has everybody signed this now? Yeah, just pass it up. Just pass it up this way, or you can walk it up if you like, if you want the exercise. Well, anyway, another thing to really make a name for himself, Napoleon attacks Egypt. What? That's not very close to France. Why is he attacking Egypt? It's pretty simple why he's attacking. Everybody sign this? All right, put it right here. He's attacking Egypt because Britain basically controls Egypt or has an agreement. Egypt is weak, Britain is strong, and Britain is using Egypt as a way to move a lot of materials through there. See, if you notice in the map here, up here's England, down here's Egypt. You go through the Mediterranean, and then from there you can put it in the Red Sea, all the goods. And then you can sail it to India, to China, or wherever. And so basically they were using Egypt as a crossroads, as a bridge between the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea, which connected them to India, China, and elsewhere. So Napoleon said, you know what? Egypt's kind of weak. I can go take Egypt. That'll look good. I probably win. And he does. He goes down. The Egyptians are no match for the French. And they defeat them. He calls it the Battle of the Nile. A great victory on the Battle of the Nile where he defeats the Mamluks. Sends back reports about his great victory. Guess what? The British find out, and then they send their navy. Napoleon doesn't have much of a navy. And so Napoleon, he's in Egypt, he's in Palestine, he's like Israel. He's over in that area. He's having a lot of victory, and then the British show up with their navy, Lord Nelson. And Napoleon knows they're not going to win. So you know what Napoleon does? Napoleon gets on a boat. Yes, who said that? He leaves. Yeah, he gets on a boat and he heads back to France and he leaves other people in charge. And by the time he gets back, of course, they've all heard the news about his great victories in Egypt. And he says, yes, I've had some wonderful victories in Egypt. I won the Battle of the Nile. I defeated the Mamluks. We've given it on the chin to the British. He knows bad times are coming. Probably already happened. But here's the thing. It was on Napoleon's side. They didn't have instantaneous news. Today something could happen and, like seconds later, minutes later, probably people all over the world can know about it, right? Through cell phones and websites and, Twitter and all other kinds of things. No, they're not going to find out about the fact that the British went down there and really beat them up. Of course, Napoleon said, well, I wasn't there at the time. I left and everything was fine. It must have been those guys I left in charge who didn't do their job right. But anyway, he's gonna ride through on that popularity. And that's it. Now, one of the things he does do, incidentally, since, I'm teaching a class right now on ancient Egypt. I teach a lot of different classes, but in that one, really, you could credit Napoleon with starting Egyptology, the study of Egypt, A lot of the names for Egyptology actually come from French, the French language. Why? Because the first real studiers of Egypt, Europeans, were French. It's Napoleon's troops who find this object that you see pictured here. It's called the Rosetta Stone. You've probably heard of it. It's very famous. It's a lot bigger than that. It's at least the size of two of these tables put together, the top of that. And it's about that thick. If you want to see it, do you go to France? Do you go to Egypt? No. You know where you go? England, yes. Who said that? Somebody over there. I thought I heard somebody say England. Yes, it's in the British Museum in London. By the way, if you ever get to London, and I hope you do, promise me, just right now, just promise me, you will go to the British Museum, at least for an afternoon. It deserves more than that, but at least an afternoon or a morning. It's free to get in, by the way. Absolutely free. It's one of the best museums in the world. Now, and I want you to find that Rosetta. It won't be hard to find it. It's right in the entranceway. And when you come in, it's going to be right there because it's one of their prized possessions. And they have all kinds of stuff. All kinds of stuff related to the Bible, all kinds of stuff related to Assyria, Egypt, Mesopotamia, all this, and then other history too. I mean, it's an amazing place. Sometimes I see people say they went to London. So you go to the British Museum? No. Like, oh, really? At least a couple hours, all right? And it's free. That's the thing about the museums in London. Almost all of them are free. They got a lot of great museums. Well, that's my commercial for the museums in London, for which I get no compensation. Well, the Rosetta Stone, it has three parts. I mean, even if you don't know anything about the Rosetta Stone, you can look right up there and you can see there's three parts, right? Top, middle, bottom. The top part's written in hieroglyphs. The bottom part's written in Greek. The middle part's written in a script it's a Demotic script, which is of the Egyptian language. So the top two are in the Egyptian language, the bottom's in the Greek language, and it's got two kinds of script. Long story short, this is what's used to decipher hieroglyphs. I'm not going to go through how they did it. That's for another class. But this begins Egyptology, and he also brings other scholars with him. They study not only like the ancient tombs, monuments, pyramids, but they're also studying the Nile, the plants, the animals. Pretty amazing stuff, and they produce these giant books, description of Egypt. And they're doing it all pretty quickly, because they get kicked out by the British pretty quickly. So I'm always amazed how much they got done in a relatively short time. But one of the things that soldiers do find near a town called Rosetta, this stone, when they were building a fort, they kind of dug it out of someplace. They flipped it over and they said, oh, this might be important. And they were right. Well, the British controlled the seas, so Napoleon flees, as I said. The Directory knew what was going on. The Directory, that's the government of France, remember, who had sort of hired or brought Napoleon in because he was successful. They wanted to charge him with desertion, deserting the army, which, he did. But he was pretty smooth about it all. And he basically had promoted himself so much to the people of France as a hero, as a great general, and so on. And he had won in Egypt, that they were afraid that if they said, hey, he's really lost in Egypt and he abandoned his men and all that, the people wouldn't believe it. And so basically they did not charge him with desertion, which would be, probably treason. Treason was often punishable by death, at least it used to be. They're not going to do that. He's just way too popular. And then, in just a short time after that, he actually takes control. In December of 1799, in the wave of all this popularity, he takes control of France. He basically sort of kicks out the Directory. He doesn't kill them. It's a bloodless takeover, bloodless coup. And then to show that, everybody supports him, he has what's called a plebiscite. Plebiscite is, one of those fancy words, I guess. It comes in part from Latin for plebe or plebeian. A plebe was a common person, in Roman society. So a plebiscite means we are asking the common people, the regular people, what they think. It's sort of, it's not really an election, because the outcome is, Napoleon's going to be in charge whether he gets a lot of votes or not. So they're not really voting him in. He's just saying, I took over, now do you support me as your leader? And they did. Like 90, in the 90%, any politician today would love to have the votes that Napoleon was getting. He's getting like 95, 98% of all the people are saying, yes, Napoleon, we think you're great. Our politicians can't even really get 51% anymore, right? So he's got the support of the people because they're believing his story. He's a great leader. He's a great military guy. He can lead France to victory. He can help us out. So now Napoleon is in power. So what he's going to do is he's going to name himself First Consul. Where's he getting that from? Where's the word council come from? Anybody know? What's that? Heard somebody whisper something. Sometimes I can't. It comes from a different time period, a different kind of the government. It's a government post of an earlier kind of government. What's that? Counselor? Well, counselor is sort of. I'm thinking about ancient. Yeah, go ahead.
Like a judge.
Sort of like a judge, too. It's coming from ancient Rome. The ancient Romans had a government set up where they had two councils because they didn't want to have any king or emperor. So the very top of their thing, and typically then you only serve for 1 year. So it was two guys who sort of shared power for 1 year. That was so no one person really got too much power. This is part of the Romans. They did not want to have a king. Now they ended up with an emperor, so, well, we're not going to go there and talk about all that. But that's where he gets the name from. He's taken from the ancient Romans. And so in many regards, remember the ancient Roman Empire had continued on in the eastern part and somewhat into Western Europe. And in fact, there was a leader called the Holy Roman Emperor, of which Charlemagne was the very first one, who sort of took the Roman ideas and titles, added Christianity to it, and had a much reduced territory in Europe. So he's kind of taking it from that idea that he is the council. But notice he's the only one. There's not two. And it's not for a year, it's for life. Now, that's a pretty good job if you can get it, right? Being something for life. I'm never going to have a job like that where they say, oh, by the way, you're professor for life. No. If they want to give it to me, that's great. I'll take it. But, it's not going to happen. Now, the only downside of that, if you're the president or the council or whatever, for life, there's only one way to get a new ruler. you got to get rid of you. I guess you could just decide to step down on your own, but if you're pushing for this kind of title, you're probably not wanting to do that. Well, he was still very popular with the people, and in 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of France. So France went from having a king, and then having all this revolution that we talked about earlier, where we're trying to get, more power to the people and, all this sort of stuff. And guess what? They end up with an emperor. Got a lot of power. Napoleon pretty much had all the power. He was an absolute ruler of France. So they went from an absolute ruler was a king, and they ended up with an absolute ruler was an emperor. One was based on nobility. The other one is based, Napoleon is going to institute what he calls the nobility of merit. So we see they go from king to emperor. And here is a picture. That's not a very good picture. I could find a better one. But this is a famous painting of Napoleon. He crowns himself, and then he crowns Josephine. Here's Josephine. He's going to crown her empress. He crowns himself emperor, then he will crown her empress. Now he's got the Pope there, as you know, and all the other trappings, but he doesn't let anybody else crown him. Because you know what? If you let somebody else crown you, you know what the implication is? Somebody could uncrown you, right? This is one of the problems. You know, Charlemagne was crowned by the Pope, and that led to a long controversy between the church and the leaders, that if the church is crowning people, the church can uncrown people and put somebody else in. Napoleon didn't want that. Well, here, I did find a better picture. There it is. That's the same picture. It's just much more colorful here. You can see Napoleon holding up the crown. Here's Josephine. Over here are the church leaders. Okay, but that's a very famous painting. 1804, Napoleon crowning himself. Well, let's move on. Napoleon then is going to go about reorganizing France. And you know, I give Napoleon some credit. I mean, a lot of stuff he reorganized is actually, a lot of that was pretty good. In fact, a lot of it's kind of still around in France in different forms. You know, not identical, but some, 200 years, more than 200 years later, some of the stuff he did is still around. Well, he reorganized the government because France's government was very divided up, you know. He wants to centralize it. Now, make no mistake, I mean, he's doing that for efficiency, but he's also doing that so he can make sure he runs everything. You know, if things are centralized, then, well, you know, I can keep tabs on it. When things are uncentralized, it's hard for me to keep track of what's going on. The other thing he's going to do is he's going to appoint all the leaders in this government. All of them, they will not be elected, they will be appointed, and they will be appointed by him. So that means that all these leaders know they have their position because Napoleon gave them their position. And guess what? That also means they know they could lose the position and Napoleon could take it from them and give it to somebody else. So that means they're going to be a little more cooperative with Napoleon, right? Probably a lot more cooperative than if they sort of felt entitled to this. This has been part of what's been going on in France, is that nobility felt entitled to it because they had a title as a nobility, and this sort of came with their title. Napoleon says, no, I'm going to choose the people. If you don't do your job, switch you out. He does have advisors. He does have a council of advisors, but notice they're only advisors. So what you don't see here is any kind of a parliament or some kind of Congress, representative government or something. No. Napoleon runs it all. Now he does have advisors who say, okay, advise me about economic things, advise me about this and that. They come to him with information and he makes the decision. They don't make the decision. And he will also create governmental ministries, he's going to call them. This is what we might call departments, ministries. So, and then there will be a person in charge of that who will be the minister, like the minister of finance. Okay, the minister of the interior or something, interior concerns. Minister of foreign policy or foreign affairs. So, but again, he creates all of those and he puts the people, the heads of those in. Another thing he does is he creates the Bank of France. This is still around. Up to this point, the money had all been regional. From each city. Each city would mint their own coins, things like that. He's going to centralize it. This will obviously give him control. It'll also standardize things. He standardizes weights and measures and the amount of what money is. Like if I get if we did this in the United States, and let's say I had dollars from Tampa, somebody else had dollars from Atlanta, somebody else had dollars from Chicago or something, they may not all be worth the same amount. So if I come to buy a good, if I'm coming to buy goods from you, whatever, food or whatever it is, and then I'm going to pay you in Chicago money or Atlanta money, and I'm in Tampa, what does that mean? How much is your money worth? These are part of the problems. And also, if I'm going to buy, let's say, a measure of gas, we say a gallon of gas, right? So it's the same, but they may have different measures. A gallon in Tampa might be different than a gallon in Atlanta. By the way, when you pump a gallon of gas, how do you know you're getting a gallon of gas? I'm just asking. You never measure it. Just imagine if a guy, who had a gas station would give you 9/10 of a gallon for every gallon, how much money you'd make at the end of the week, the end of the month. This is why they have, a little sticker on there, and you say somebody comes around and inspects it. But, you can just say, buddy, Well, anyway, this is why we have bureaus of weights and measures and all that kind of stuff, to try to keep everything honest. So that when I pump a gallon of gas, I actually get a gallon of gas. Part of the problem in France was not all the units of measure were the same, and it was hard. I mean, if somebody was selling you gas in liters, even if they really gave you a liter, and somebody else was doing it in gallons, and somebody else was doing it in something else, and then the prices were all in different kinds of money, how could you tell what was a good deal and what wasn't? The short answer is you wouldn't. You wouldn't know. And it makes commerce hard. So that's part of the reason he did it. Those are internal reforms. Another internal reform, I was going to say infernal, I almost said infernal reform. No, internal reform is with the laws. He starts up and changes all the laws of France in what comes to be known as the Napoleonic Code. Napoleonic Law Code. Those of you interested in laws, legal things, being a lawyer, stuff, you ought to be familiar with Napoleonic Law Code because, some of those ideas stick in Europe and so forth. He reorganizes the entire legal system in France. He reorganizes the whole thing. And this is really the first unified set of laws in France. Because before this time, there were a lot of regional laws. So you'd live in the area of Burgundy, let's say. So you'd have Burgundian law, and you'd have, and so on. So Normandy, Burgundy, Champagne, and so forth. So you'd have all these rules, and they might be different regionally. He's going to unify the laws like he unified the money. And what he's going to do is he's going to keep all the changes the French Revolution brought. So, for example, like abolishing serfdom. And he's basically going to get rid of nobility and so forth. He's going to get a lot of those sort of social changes. He's going to now make them laws across France in this Napoleonic Code. Now, another thing he was very interested in doing was strengthening the family. Sounds like a lot of politicians, right? I'm for the family and so on. Well, why? Why do politicians worry about that? Because that brings stability. If the family is not cohesive, for example, if you got a lot of kids that don't have parents or only have one parent or whatever, or if you got a lot of, divorce and a lot of just everybody going all over the place, if we don't have a family unit, the family unit becomes sort of the backbone of society. This is part of the problem we have in the United States. Again, I don't get very political, but the family unit is taking it pretty tough, right? There's a lot of families that are not a unit. They're not very unified. And so that makes it tough. It makes it tough on kids, it makes it tough on everybody. And also makes it tough on society as a whole, because it creates all kinds of other pressures and problems. So Napoleon wanted to get it strengthening the family and marriage. So that, and for them to have children. And for those children to have two parents, two people to help with the finances and with the raising and with all the other things. To him, he saw that as the backbone of France. And his model, of course, is going to be himself. Now, Napoleon was not perfect, but he saw his relationship to France, that he was the ruler, sort of like he was the husband of France, if you will. He's the emperor of France, and then France was sort of like his bride. So he uses that model then, at least in theory, with his lady here, Josephine. And so the husband then, he would say in these laws, should be the head of the family. Should take care of things. And he really tried to limit divorce, make it pretty tough, or tougher anyway, to get a divorce, to keep families together. Because, when tough times come, and by the way, they will, it's pretty easy to bail out. You just bail out and that's it, right? Well, it's not just that's it, because there's a lot of stuff that goes with it. But he wants to make it harder for that to happen. All right, so that's a Napoleonic code. Now here's another thing he does. Remember I told you one of the most controversial things about the French Revolution was the fact that the French Revolution basically eliminated the Roman Catholic Church from France. Remember that? They not only took over all the land, they took over the whole church, and then at one point during the Reign of Terror, they just eliminated the church. They changed the cathedral, Notre Dame Cathedral, dedicated to Mary, into a temple of reason. This did not sit well with a lot of sort of regular French people, people out in the countryside and stuff. They didn't really like this part of it. Why are they getting rid of the whole church? So Napoleon wants to find a way to bring it back. But again, he wants to bring it back in a Napoleon way, right? A Napoleonic way. So what he does is he invites, I'm going to put that in air quotes, he invites the Pope to a meeting. Now, how can we translate that? Well, you might say he kidnapped the Pope, put him in a castle, for his own protection, and then we're going to have a meeting. Now, Pope, I want to try to work on this. It's Pope Pius VII. Pope Pius, let's see if we can work this out. So what I'm trying to tell you that so that you will know the Pope doesn't really have many options. First of all, the church is pretty much almost non-existent in France. Secondly, he's being held and kind of forced to meet with Napoleon, and Napoleon is basically saying, okay, here's the deal. You want to bring back the Roman Catholic Church in France? We can do that, but, of course, you have to accept the fact that the Roman Catholic Church in France is under the government of France, under me. See? The Pope's very limited. Pope didn't like it, but didn't have much choice. And it did then bring back the Roman Catholic Church again, in a changed way, in a limited way. And of course that was good. It played pretty well. Napoleon read that pretty well. A lot of people didn't like that the church had been forced out. So church services begin again. So that's called the Concordat of 1801, when he has his meeting with the Pope. Now, Napoleon is also, like we said, nobility is gone. But he likes the idea of nobility. He just doesn't like it the old-fashioned way. In other words, you're born with it. I'm born, since my parents are noble, I'm noble. Your parents aren't noble, you aren't noble. Sorry. That's just the way it is. Napoleon wanted a different way. What was his way? He would hand out nobility. The government would hand out nobility. He's going to call it a nobility of merit. So you could basically earn nobility, earn your status, so you could sort of advance that way. Now he saw his rule, that's what I mean by that statement, he saw his rule as the natural progress of the French Revolution. So he's not wanting to do away with the French Revolution. He in fact thinks he is the natural outcome of the French Revolution. knowing Napoleon, he probably thinks the whole French Revolution happened just so I could be in charge. Right? He didn't suffer from low self-esteem, Napoleon, right? He thought pretty highly of himself. I think that's an understatement. So again, what I make that point to let you know, he's not going to go in and kind of reverse everything back to the way it was when they had a king, and then he's going to be like an emperor. He's going to be like a king but called emperor. No, he's going to take the French Revolution, and he's going to say, you know what? France needs a strong ruler, and that's me. And it's going to be an emperor. But all this other stuff, nobility and serfdom and, etc., that's all gone, and that's not coming back. So, and he sees that him being emperor was the natural progress of the French Revolution, that it was really supposed to end that way. It was supposed to be that way. All right, that's internal stuff. What about external stuff? Well, remember, back during the French Revolution in the 1790s, the revolution had been exported. We talked about that previously. And so these ideas of the French Revolution that, some of them I imagine you might thought were pretty good ideas, like ending serfdom, ending feudalism, which is basically getting rid of nobility and all those things. Well, basically that's what's going to happen in the 70s. And some of that is taking place before Napoleon, but he's going to continue it and expand it. Also, we're going to see that the Holy Roman Empire is going to end in 1806. The Holy Roman Empire had been around since 800 A.D. It had been around over 1,000 years. Now, it had weakened over the years, but it was still there, and it was now gone. In so doing, then, the territories of the Holy Roman Emperor are now brought under the influence, control of France. And that means that Napoleon establishes what he's going to call the Grand Duchy of Warsaw. Napoleon became a big hero to Polish people. Why? Because you remember we talked about, last week maybe, the partitioning of Poland, how Poland was divided up between Prussia and Russia and Austria, and there was no Poland. Napoleon brings Poland back. Basically, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw is a Polish territory. It's not all of it, but it's a big chunk of the Polish territory. So he becomes a hero to Polish people because we now have an entity again. We had nothing. Now we have it. So he frees Poland, especially from Russian control, and establishes this Grand Duchy of Warsaw. So he's redrawing the map of Europe. He's changing the customs of Europe, the laws of Europe. And all this territory that he either directly takes or indirectly controls are now all going to have the Napoleonic Code. They're all going to have all these rules that we just talked about internally. That's going to be applied externally. Now, what are they going to have to do? Well, for the benefit of all this great stuff Napoleon did, they're going to have to pay taxes. They're going to have to give money to Napoleon. They're also going to have to give troops to Napoleon's army when he needs them. He begins to put his relatives in charge of these things. Here is Napoleon's brother. His name is Jerome. The king, he becomes the king of Westphalia. You remember Jerome. Let's see, his brothers, Jerome, Germain, Michael, Jackie. Oh, no, wait a minute. That's other brothers. Yeah, that's the Jacksons. That's not Napoleon. Jackson 5. No. Jerome, because he was a famous, well, I guess not as famous as Michael, but he was a famous Jackson, right? I always like, my favorite Jackson brother name anyway? Tito. Tito. I like that name. Tito. Anyway. That's just true. I guess that was the fifth one I didn't name before. Maybe I put that on the test. I got to name the 5 Jackson, Jackson 5. Name the names of the brothers. And then, if the bonus point will be, who became the fifth Jackson when Michael left? Marlin. All right. That's extra credit. No, that's not going to happen. That was just for fun. That's just to wake you up. And I could see it didn't work for a lot of you. You still have, what's that?
You could do that.
See, I could. Multiple choice question, maybe a bonus thing.
Mm-hmm.
Which of the following is not a Jackson 5 member? What's the names?
Mm-hmm.
Put Fred down there. It'd be pretty easy. No Fred Jackson that I know of, at least not in the Jackson 5. Well, anyway, he created the Confederation of the Rhine. Germany had been divided and divided and divided. In the time of Martin Luther, you remember heard of Martin Luther, the guy in Germany, the Reformation, right? There were over 300 principalities in Germany. And you know who liked that? Generally the French liked that. The Prussians liked that. The Russians liked that. The Austrians liked that. Why? As long as Germany was divided in all these little tiny territories, they're never going to be a threat. But really, it's Napoleon who unites them in what's called the Confederation of the Rhine. So all up and down the Rhine, those territories are united. So this is uniting Western Germany, at least. We see that Prussia increases some of its territory and becomes an ally, at least in theory, of Napoleon. It ends many small, inefficient states across Europe, and there were a lot of them, especially in Germany, Switzerland, other places like that. Little tiny. There's still a few remnants of it today, right? Liechtenstein. You could drive across Liechtenstein in like 20 minutes. It's tiny. Luxembourg. These are very small states. There were a lot of those. There were hundreds of those. But Napoleon eliminated most of them. And it made it more efficient. But they also had to follow all the internal reforms. All these places that Napoleon is sort of taking over and reorganizing, and he's putting his relatives in charge, like Jerome here, in charge of these territories. So that in fact, he's creating a kind of royalty of his family, even though, technically there is nobility, there isn't any royalty, but there is. By the way, what's very interesting, if you ever go to Paris, and I hope you do, one of the things I would recommend you visit, now there's a lot of stuff to see in all these places I'm telling you about, but they do have the place where Napoleon is buried. It's right next to the French Military Museum. Makes sense because France's biggest expansion and greatest military was under Napoleon. And so Napoleon is buried there in an elaborate building. It's sort of circular with a big dome, and he's in a sarcophagus. He's in this big stone purple sarcophagus. But off from that big round dome in the center are the smaller domes of his brothers. So they're all there with him because they were all also rulers. Well, here's a painting of Napoleon. Right? Now, internationally, Napoleon wants to take charge, right? Internationally speaking. His biggest rival, because remember, Napoleon now has pretty much controls Western Europe. He's brought either directly or indirectly Spain, Prussia, Austria, what we might call Germany today, Belgium, all those places, Italy, northern Italy, all those places are really under French control directly or indirectly. So who is he not included in this? Who is the biggest power in Europe outside of France? You tell me. Who is it? It's right up there on the screen, by the way, because I revealed too much. Yes, England. England is still free. England is still powerful. England's still, many people would say, the most powerful nation in the world. Napoleon didn't like that. He didn't like anybody thinking they were more powerful than France, and he didn't like the idea of England anyway, because they're English and we're French. But they had a great navy. The things that have always saved England, at least in the past, being an island and having a great navy. If we want to summarize it, it's the fact that they're an island and because they're an island, they got a great navy. That's what saved them time and time and time again for hundreds of years. That's why, for us, building the tunnel that connects France and England, they have a tunnel now that goes under the English Channel and a train goes through there. They used to call the train the Chunnel, or they used to call the thing the Chunnel because it was a channel tunnel. I don't hear that used much anymore, but it is a train. In other words, you can get on a train in London. I've done it. You get on a train in London and hour and a half later, you're in downtown Paris. You never get off the train. Something like that. I forgot the exact time, but it's about like that. You go really fast. Now, for a lot of people in England, when they were building that channel, they were not happy because they're saying this is the defense of England has always been the English Channel. And by the way, there are people that come to France, they go down into the channel, they hide on the trains, and they're actually being transported into England illegally or whatever by getting on the trains. And so they have to really patrol that train now. In fact, I don't know if it was true, but I heard when they first built the channel, people were so concerned about it that on the British side that they actually said, I don't know if they did, that they installed explosives so that if they needed to, they could blow up the tunnel on their end and stop an invasion by Europe. Have it collapse in. Well, I don't know if that's true or not, but those stories were there, and that's that idea that this is what's guarded England. And that's why Napoleon never took over England. He didn't have a good navy. They're on an island. And so but he wants to block them, so he begins a kind of blockade of England. So you notice, he declares war on Austria and France. France and Austria are at war, England, and so forth. France had defeated all their enemies by 1805. Only England remained free. So here is a map of Napoleonic Europe. Now notice the dark green section is the French Empire. Includes France, northern Italy, parts of Austria, and so forth. But then notice that this lighter green is under French control. Look at that. It's all of Spain, Confederation of the Rhine, the Grand Duchy of Warsaw, and then the stuff in the kind of the tan, these are allies. These had signed agreements. So basically, almost everywhere is either French ally, French controlled territory, or the French Empire. All the way across, from Portugal all the way to Russia. Only England is not. And so he wants to try to starve out England. So he starts what comes to be called the continental system. The continental system was to isolate, sort of freeze out Great Britain economically. How? By an embargo. It basically said no British ships can land in Europe. No British goods can be traded in Europe. Well, this is going to really hurt the British economy, right? There are things that they might need from Europe, and there are things certainly they would want to sell in Europe, and that's not supposed to happen. And so we see that even the French even began to curtail. What they didn't want is, like, say the British would go to some port outside of like in Scandinavia, and then somebody would come there and get it and then take it there. Even that was outlawed. So basically, they didn't want any British goods flowing to Europe, Western Europe. They didn't want any goods from Western Europe going to England. So we see, though, not all is peachy keen. Between 1807 and 1812, several countries try to rebel against Napoleon and his control, including people in Germany, Confederation of the Rhine, and Spain. So Napoleon had to spend a lot of time putting down these revolts and maintaining his power. At about that same time, between 1807 and 1812, when Napoleon is having trouble keeping control, this is when Russia decides they are no longer going to follow that continental system. That is, they're going to begin to trade with England. This is in defiance to Napoleon. Remember, Russia's the furthest away from France, and it's larger than France. Not as militarily powerful, but you know what? So we're going to go on our own. We're going to start trading with the British. And of course, Napoleon knows once that happened, all the goods are going to come across the Russian border into Prussia, into Austria. The whole thing will be messed up. This is what leads then to Napoleon attacking Russia. Why did Napoleon invade Russia? He invaded Russia because they would not follow the continental system. And that happens in 1812. June of 1812, Napoleon invades Russia with a huge army of about 600,000 troops. These are not all French troops. Remember I told you, there'll be Polish troops, there'll be German troops, all these other areas that are under his control. They're going to have to bring up weapons and soldiers and so forth to come and be under Napoleon's command. So he assembles a coalition army of French territories and French-controlled areas, and he begins a march eastward to Russia. Now, the Russians have always had an ally in battle. You know who the biggest ally that Russia has always had in battle? The winter. The winter. Right? It's coming. Now, Napoleon's not starting till June. In retrospect, he should have started sooner. But it's easy to always look back and say, you know what, I should have done. This guy should have done. Especially when we see somebody else. Oh, he shouldn't have done it that way. What was he thinking? Why did he do that? I wouldn't have done that. It's pretty easy to say after the fact. Well, Napoleon then, in June, does an invasion. Now, he thought it would be pretty simple. Maybe not real simple, but he would have to march to Moscow. He would take over Moscow, and then the Russians would surrender, and then they would re-implement the continental system, and then everything would kind of go back to the way Napoleon thought it ought to be. So his goal is to get to Moscow. The Russians used tactics that really weren't, Napoleon might say, fair. They were not normal, certainly. What did they do? Well, they did not come out and engage Napoleon in battle. I did that a couple of times. But a lot of times, basically the way they would fight battles here, you get out in a big field, and, our guys get on one side and their guys get on another side, and we start firing artillery, and then we do a charge, and then we shoot or whatever and use bayonets, and then we see who, at the end of that battle, who won, right? Pretty simple. Well, deadly, but simple to figure that out. That's not what the Russians did. Why? Because they knew they wouldn't win that way. Napoleon was a lot better at that than them. So you know what they did? Russia is a very big country. They just started backing up. All right, you're coming into this part? We back up here. You keep coming? And when they back up, you know what they do? If you got 600,000 guys, I don't know how many students we have here on campus that eat over there eat lunch over there on a daily basis. But you imagine just feeding a couple thousand, 2,000, 3,000 students is a big undertaking to feed them every day, right? To make sure there's enough food for everybody. Imagine if you had 600,000 people and you were on the move. How are you going to feed them? They counted on feeding them by what they took along the way. They would come into a farm, they'd take the chickens, they'd take the eggs, they'd eat the chickens and the eggs. They would take the grain, they would take the cows. Yeah, eat the cows. See what I'm saying? You know what the Russians did? When they left, they took it all with them, and what they couldn't take with them, they burned. They burned their own country. So that as Napoleon is advancing, it's scorched earth. He didn't scorch it, they did. So, this makes it very tough. The Russians refused to fight head on. They keep backing up. Napoleon keeps getting further and further away from his supply lines. Because if he can't get any food as he moves forward, he's got to bring it from the back, right? He's got to bring it from Austria. He's got to bring it from Prussia. He's got to bring it from Poland, wherever he can get the food. And he's got to do that a lot, because 600,000 people eat a lot of food a day, even if they're not getting 3 meals. You imagine just serving 1 meal a day to 600,000 people. That's a lot. That's a lot to deal with. A lot of logistics. Just having water and some food. Whew. Well, the Russians don't make it any easier. They burn and they retreat. They burn and they retreat. Occasionally they'll engage them. Occasionally they win. But most of the time they just avoid direct battle. Then what happens is they kind of hit the French on the flanks. Like once they kind of guerrilla warfare, we call it. What do we call it? We call it asynchronous, not asynchronous, but anyway, they're hitting them not in a pitched battle. All right. When they did have a pitched battle at the Battle of Borodino, Napoleon won. He knows how to handle that. But he suffers heavy losses. At any rate, he is closing on Moscow. The picture's kind of the giveaway of what's going to happen, because that's Moscow. When he gets to Moscow, you know what they did? They torched Moscow. This is their capital. This is a fancy city, right? A lot of buildings. You know what they did? They went to the prisons and they released all the prisoners. They went to the mental asylums and they released all the patients. And they torched all the buildings and they left. So when Napoleon gets there, conqueror of Moscow, everything's burning. They got these people roaming the streets. This is not what he expected. And guess what? The Tsar of Russia, Alexander I, refuses to negotiate. He says, no, I'm not going to come and talk to you. I'm not going to come and surrender. You want us? Come get us. We got a lot more Russia to go. We're just going to keep backing up, and we're going to keep burning and running until, the winter is coming. The winter is coming. Our biggest ally, like some of those movies, like, people are trapped and they're waiting for somebody to come in and help them. Used to be the old cowboy movies. It was the cavalry, right? The cavalry is going to come and bail us out. Winter is coming. I think that would be a good thing for a TV show. Winter is coming. And when winter comes, Napoleon knows he's in trouble, because his troops began marching in June. It's now in October, and it's getting cold, and the troops do not have winter clothing. They also don't have much food. They're also losing heart. Many of them begin to defect. They just leave, because they're not French anyway. And then when Napoleon runs and leaves his men, just like he did in Egypt and Palestine, you remember how he ran? He does it again. He heads back, so I got to get back to Paris. I got to solidify myself, because when news gets out of this, I got troubles. And so he heads back and he leaves the other guys in charge. And then all those guys have to fight their way back home. This is when the Russians hit them then, right? Hey, you guys, come on. Burn, burn, burn. Then once they turn and start to leave, Russians are all over those guys. They're killing them. They're chasing them. It's terrible. They must fight their way back home. This is Tsar Alexander. That was his strategy. You know what? It worked. It was a painful way to have something work, but he had it work. Now, there were heavy losses. Remember when I told you Napoleon left, he had 600,000 men in June. When the remnants of his army returns to Europe in January, 40,000 men return. That's 560,000 men that did not return. Now, what happened to those 560,000? A lot of them died. Some of them died in battle. Some of them died because they were frozen. Some of them died because they starved. Some of them just ran off. I'm going home, man. I'm getting out of here. And they took off. So, there were defectors or whatever, a lot of those. So it's hard to know how many people died. But what we do know is when the army left, it was 600,000. When it came back, it was 40. And that news spreads pretty fast that Napoleon was greatly defeated. And his plan to take Russia, I think it's safe to say, did not work out very well for Napoleon. And Napoleon's now back in France. So the defeat is going to encourage others to revolt against him. They say, well, if the Russians did that, if the French army's on the run, well, maybe we can defect. So there's a Battle of Leipzig. And they form a coalition now of, Austrians, Prussians, and so forth. And they begin to march on, they do a counter march. They start to march towards Paris. Paris falls to this coalition forces. And Napoleon is out of power. He's arrested. He's put on trial. He is not executed. What happens to Napoleon? Well, this is interesting. You might say Napoleon's he's out, but he's not gone because he's still alive. Well, here's what happens. Napoleon is sentenced to live on an island called Elba. Elba is in the Mediterranean. It's actually not that far from Corsica, where he grew up. And you know what they told him? Kind of to humiliate him. They said, "You are now the emperor of Elba." This little tiny island. It's not, it's not a good place. It doesn't have fertile soil, a lot of rocky soil. You're the emperor of Elba. Okay, run that. And they put a king back in place in France. They found a descendant of the king, the king that had his head chopped off, put him back in power. They initiate the Congress of Vienna. And they're starting to figure out what to do now. But guess what? Napoleon escapes. You think the story's over? No. Napoleon still had people who supported him. And they came out with a boat, basically, to make a long story short, and they picked him up. Took him to southern France. The word gets out throughout France. Napoleon is back. His men begin, assemble. He tells them, all my men, tell my men to assemble. And they assemble, and he revives his army in March of 1815. And they go back into battle again. There ought to be some movies about this or something, right? Don't you think? Well, I don't know. And he goes back into battle again. So these guys at the Congress of Vienna, all sitting around tables in Vienna, suddenly find out Napoleon's back, and he's got an army, so then they have to go back to fight him. Now, of course, he doesn't have the same kind of numbers as he had, but they have to stop what they're doing, and they have to go out and fight him again. And so Napoleon, however, of course, has been weakened, and his position has been weakened. He declares himself emperor again. This is often called the 100 days, Napoleon's 100 days. Why? From the time he escapes to the time that, spoiler alert, he's captured again, it's 100 days. So he gets, he gets a little over 3 months back at it. He's weakened, and, eventually he is defeated. The British and the Prussians team up against him under General Wellington. And as you might well know, Napoleon faces his last battle, the Battle of Waterloo. So Waterloo becomes a symbol. Somebody say, "Oh, that was his Waterloo." They'll say that about other people. "Oh, that's his Waterloo." There's even a song that's called Waterloo. You're thinking of the ABBA song, but I'm thinking of a different song. Well, you don't know who ABBA is, so don't worry about it. But they got a song called Waterloo. But there was another one, as Waterloo, Waterloo, when will you meet your Waterloo? Well, I hope that doesn't happen to you, but it did to Napoleon. Napoleon that time is taken a captive, and he is now sent to another island. This island is St. Helena, and St. Helena is in the South Atlantic. It's about halfway between Africa and South America, like Brazil. It's way down there, and it's out in the middle of nowhere, literally, and it's a rugged, rocky island with a lot of wind all the time and a lot of mosquitoes and stuff. And Napoleon is put there in prison, basically, and he will eventually die of a fever, maybe malaria. And a few years later, his body's brought back to France. And remember, I told you, they buried him in a beautiful mausoleum. You can go see it today. But Napoleon changed the course of history, not only of France, but of Europe. He's quite a character of European history that has major influence. He dies in 1821. Well, look at that. Don't say I never let you out early. It's 1:14. All right, have a good weekend.